This is Video 3, Summary of Potential Impacts from the Proposed Action Alternative. The FAA's Environmental Orders 5050 Airport Environmental Handbook and 1051F Environmental Impacts, Policies and Procedures identify several environmental impact categories or resource categories that an EA should consider when analyzing the potential environmental consequences from a project's no action and proposed action alternatives. For the proposed terminal area plan and changes to air traffic procedures at Chicago O'Hare International Airport project, the FAA determined that potential impacts from the proposed action to the following environmental resource categories would be analyzed along with the no action and documented in Chapter 5 of the EA. Air quality, climate, noise and noise-compatible land use, historical, architectural, archaeological, and cultural resources. Department of Transportation Act, Section 4F. Biological resources, light emissions and visual impacts, hazardous materials, solid waste and pollution prevention, natural resources and energy supply, socioeconomics, environmental justice, and children's environmental health and safety risks, surface transportation and parking, water resources including wetlands, floodplains, surface waters, and groundwater, irreversible and irretrievable commitment of resources, and cumulative impacts. This video provides a summary of the potential impacts from the proposed alternative to these environmental resource categories. The FAA determined that certain environmental resources do not require detailed analysis, either in whole or in part, since the interim proposed action or the build-out proposed action would not have the potential to adversely or beneficially impact the affected environment associated with these resources. As a result, the EA does not examine the potential effects on coastal resources, farmlands, and land use. Aviation activity forecasts are integral elements of the EA evaluation process and form the basis upon which several key environmental resources are established. The Chicago Department of Aviation submitted its forecast for enplanements and operations to the FAA prior to beginning the analyses of potential impacts. The FAA completed a comprehensive review of the forecasts and determined they were reasonable and appropriate for the environmental modeling purposes of the EA. The analysis of gated flight schedules demonstrated that the forecast for future activity can be accommodated on the existing gates, albeit with a reduced level of service. This means there would be no potential for induced demand because of the proposed action. The air traffic forecast split annual aircraft operations into 4 categories: passenger, cargo, general aviation, and military for modeling purposes. The CDA and FAA determined that the FAA Terminal Area Forecast, or TAF, was underrepresenting passenger aircraft operations for environmental modeling purposes. The CDA also determined aircraft operations would grow at 0.9% annually compared to the 0.2% growth annually in the FAA TAF, which is appropriate for modeling purposes. Finally, the cargo forecast was based on O'Hare's historical share of U.S. cargo volume and the limited general aviation and military activity in the FAA TAF was used. The FAA and CDA considered the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was determined that CDA's future flight schedules at conclusion of the construction were appropriate for environmental modeling. In addition, the likely impact of COVID-19 would be to delay domestic passenger demand growth by 2 years, but the CDA's future flight schedule of aviation activity during those years is relatively modest. Air quality is the first environmental resource category to discuss. The team conducted two types of air quality analysis. Emissions inventories provided estimates of the amount of air pollutant emissions, and dispersion modeling provided estimates of air pollutant concentrations. The analysis found that there would be an increased amount of some criteria pollutants, although the increase would not be significant and result in less of other criteria pollutants associated with the build-out proposed action alternative compared to the build-out no action alternative. Importantly, the build-out proposed action alternative would not cause or contribute to any exceedances of the national ambient air quality standards, nor delay attainment of the ozone standard, for which the Chicago area is designated non-attainment. The location of multiple receptors identified by yellow dots on the exhibit were identified and included in the air dispersion modeling. Per the Clean Air Act, federal agencies are required to show the proposed project actions in a maintenance or non-attainment area conform to the State Implementation Plan, or SIP. Since the airport is in a non-attainment area for ozone, a general conformity analysis was required to address expected ozone pollution level exceedances. The Illinois Environmental Protection Agency determined that the project's ozone emissions are accounted for in the SIP. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is the most prevalent greenhouse gas at airports. The build-out proposed action alternative would result in an increase of 62,728 metric tons of carbon dioxide as compared to the build-out no action alternative. However, there are currently no regulatory significance thresholds or standards for greenhouse gas emissions. DNL, or the day-night average sound level, contours are used to determine potentially significant impacts in the noise and noise-compatible land use evaluation. DNL contours are developed from average annual day operations, runway use, and modeled flight tracks. DNL noise thresholds allow the FAA to evaluate changes in DNL by comparing the proposed action alternative to the no action alternative. And finally, the DNL results and level of change at noise-sensitive sites such as schools, parks, and places of worship were reported. If the proposed action alternative results in a minimum change in the DNL of 1.5 decibels at noise-sensitive sites within a 65 DNL or greater contour, the level of change is considered significant. It is considered a reportable level of change when there is a minimum change in the DNL of 3 decibels at noise-sensitive sites within a DNL contour greater than or equal to 60 DNL, but less than 65 DNL, or when there is a minimum change in the DNL of 5 decibels at noise-sensitive sites within a DNL contour greater than or equal to 45 DNL, but less than 60 DNL. The noise and noise-compatible land use analysis evaluated aircraft flight operations at the airport and up to 7,000 feet in altitude to include the proposed air traffic operations. Aircraft ground noise and noise levels at all sensitive sites within the primary study area were also evaluated. A significant noise impact would occur if there is a 1.5 decibel, or dB, increase with the proposed action 65 decibel day-night average sound level, as compared with the no action alternative over noise-sensitive land use. The analysis determined that there are 11,379 housing units, which are one type of noise-sensitive land use, with the 65 DNL noise content contour, and 6,277 of those units have not been previously mitigated by CDA due to current sound insulation program construction activity status, lack of response to offers for sound insulation, and eligibility status in the ongoing residential sound insulation program. Compared to the no action alternative, the proposed action alternative would result in a net increase of 324 housing units within the 65 DNL. A total of 227 of those 324 would be significantly impacted, and all but 3 of those 227 were previously mitigated. Of the remaining 3 housing units, 2 are scheduled to be mitigated in 2022, and 1 declined mitigation and is considered compatible with aircraft noise. As a result, the proposed action alternative would have no significant impacts to residential housing units. Exhibit 5.5-23 of the draft EA provides a comparison of the 65 DNL, 70 DNL, and 75 DNL under the proposed action and no action alternatives. The pink line on the map shows the DNL contours with no action. The blue line on the map shows the DNL contour map for the proposed action. In addition to the DNL contours, the exhibit shows existing land uses, the noise analysis primary study area, airport boundary, runways, and taxiways. Exhibit 5.5-24 of the draft EA shows a change in DNL from the proposed action alternative versus the no action alternative. The colored grid points show the locations where an increase or decrease of equal to or greater than 1.5 decibels and 3 decibels would occur under each alternative in the 65 DNL or greater and between 60 DNL and 65 DNL respectively. The pink dots represent an increase of 3 or more decibels for the proposed action. The red dots represent an increase of 1.5 decibels for the proposed action. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies such as the FAA to consider potential effects of a proposed project on historic properties. The FAA determined that 3 existing on-airport properties that may be impacted by the proposed action were eligible for the National Register of Historic Places: Terminal 1, the CDA Control Tower, and the Rotunda. The FAA determined, and the Illinois State Historic Preservation Office concurred, that the proposed action would have no effect on the CDA Control Tower and any off-airport historic resources and would have no adverse effect on Terminal 1 and the Rotunda. However, proposed alterations to Terminal 1 and the Rotunda would be consistent with the U.S. Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Section 4F of the U.S. DOT Act of 1966 protects historic sites, public parks, recreational areas, and wildlife and waterfowl refuges of national, state, or local significance. During the Section 4F analysis, the FAA identified on-airport and off-airport Section 4F properties. The FAA identified 3 on-airport historic properties: the CDA Control Tower, Terminal 1, and the Rotunda. During the Section 106 analysis. These historic sites were also considered Section 4F properties. The FAA determined that the proposed action alternative would have no Section 4F impact to the CDA Control Tower and de minimis impacts to Terminal 1 and the Rotunda. There would also be no constructive use effects to off-airport Section 4F properties. As a result, the proposed action alternative would result in no significant Section 4F impacts. Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act requires federal agencies, in consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to ensure that the proposed project is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of or destroy critical habitat of threatened and endangered species. 9 federal and state-listed plants and animals were identified through consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. However, the airport and its surrounding environs are entirely urbanized, and historic land conversions and ongoing construction disturbances limit suitable habitat for most species. As such, there is no critical habitat present on the airport and no impacts to threatened or endangered species from the proposed action alternative are expected. Potential visual impacts from light emissions would be associated with the on-airport non-aeronautical projects like hotels and the air traffic actions. The multimodal facility hotel would be on airport property but near the airport boundary, and light emissions during construction is possible. Illumination of the hotel parking areas, the building, and rooftop lighting and signage would be anticipated upon completion of construction. Light emissions from aircraft would be affected by the no-action alternative, which includes the removal of the offset approach for arrivals to runway 10 right, 28 left. However, the changes in aircraft light emissions would be very small and would have intensities similar to those experienced in existing conditions. Construction of the proposed action alternative would generate construction solid waste. Following the City of Chicago's historical practice of recycling up to 99% of construction and demolition debris, it's expected that little to no construction solid waste would enter landfills. Solid waste during operation of the proposed action alternative is anticipated to be proportional to passenger increases and could be accommodated at existing disposal facilities. All hazardous materials would be handled in accordance with all federal, state, and local requirements to minimize impacts. Construction of the proposed action alternative would consume natural resources and energy, and the operation of O'Hare requires the consumption of electricity, natural gas, fuel oil, aviation fuel, diesel fuel, and gasoline. While there would be an increased demand under the proposed action alternative, there are adequate supplies of natural resources and energy to accommodate this demand, and no mitigation would be required. In addition, the City of Chicago Department of Aviation Sustainable Airport Manual, or SAM, identifies several sustainability practices that could be implemented to minimize the use of natural resources and energy during construction and operation of the proposed action alternative. The proposed action alternative would generally not affect socioeconomics, except for its potential effects on local surface roadway traffic patterns. There would be no land acquisition or displacement of persons or businesses, nor would there be meaningful potential for loss to a community's tax base or changes to the fabric of the community as a result of the proposed action alternative. Thus, the socioeconomic analysis was limited to surface transportation and parking. The proposed action alternative would also not affect children's environmental health and safety, since it would not involve products or substances with which a child is likely to be exposed, come into contact with, ingest, or use. Furthermore, it would not result in a concentrated, localized increase in emissions that could affect children's health. As such, there would be no increase in environmental health and safety risks that could disproportionately affect children. A detailed analysis of this subcategory was not presented in the EA. The potential impacts on surface transportation for the on-airport and off-airport roadways were analyzed. The surface transportation system consists of roadways and parking garages and parking lots for all vehicle types. The analysis evaluated the potential impact on intersections and roadway links or sections by determining anticipated changes in the operational levels of service. The analysis found that operational levels of service improved for all roadway links from the no action alternative to the proposed action alternative, and only 3 intersections would experience a decreased operational level of service. However, traffic would flow through these 3 intersections without residual impacts to adjacent intersections and would not result in significant impacts to the surface transportation network. Exhibit 512-1 of the Draft EA shows the surface transportation and parking study area and all the intersections owned and operated by the City of Chicago Department of Aviation, as well as other municipalities that were included in the analysis. In areas identified as those of environmental justice concern, the proposed action alternative would result in noise impacts exceeding the threshold of significance at 227 residences located within 9 census blocks that each lie within one of 2 block groups. The demographic characteristics of these individual blocks and block groups were compared with the characteristics of all blocks and block groups that would experience a potentially significant impact to assess disproportionate impact on EJ populations. Sound insulation has previously been installed in 224 of the 227 residences under the Chicago Department of Aviation's ongoing residential sound insulation program. 2 of the 3 remaining residences are scheduled to have installation of sound insulation completed in 2022. When completed, this sound insulation would decrease the noise impact on the dwellings to a level that is considered less than significant. The 3rd residence declined the invitation for sound insulation. Therefore, the FAA has determined that the residence is compatible for noise purposes. Due to the residential sound insulation mitigation measures decreasing noise impacts below this threshold of significance, there would be no resulting disproportionate impact to households. The water resources analysis for the EA was limited to wetlands, floodplains, surface waters, and water quality. The proposed action alternative would impact a total of 1.48 acres of non-jurisdictional wetlands and waters. These wetlands and waters are not natural and are characterized as small, isolated areas with relatively low water quality and limited runoff storage function due to their small sizes. Since no portion of the proposed action alternative would fall within the 100-year floodplain or floodway, it would not result in impacts to regulated floodplains. In addition, the proposed action alternative would not have the potential to adversely affect groundwater or wild and scenic rivers. Finally, the proposed action alternative would result in increased impervious surface areas and changes to drainage and stormwater infrastructure, but the analysis found that adequate storage exists to meet the release rate and storage requirements of the project. Potential impacts to water resources would not be significant. Cumulative impacts are the total combined impacts on the environment from the proposed action alternative and other past, present, or reasonably foreseeable actions. Past actions included were those that occurred in the 5 years prior to 2018. Present and reasonably foreseeable future actions include those that were implemented after 2018 or would be implemented by 2032. The analysis found no significant cumulative impacts would occur with the proposed action alternative. Next is video 4, how you can participate in the draft environmental assessment.